much for joining us. We've been wanting
to
have you on for a while, since the beginning, and wanted to ask you about, there's so much to talk about, and there's so many heavy, tragic, and scary, but also inspiring stories. But I wanted to talk to you first about, because you just launched a new podcast, what made you do that? And it's great. I listened to it. I really like it. But what inspired you to do that?
Oh, I first want to just salute both of you. Both of you are such forces for good and such sources of tremendous insight. And you just enact a kind of moral courage that's so necessary these days. So it's a blessing to be on the show, and I look forward to it. And it's true that Trisha Rose, the towering Trisha Rose, a pioneering scholar of hip hop, distinguished professor at Brown University, that she and I have a new podcast called The Tightrope. And we're going to have you all on, actually, to tell you the truth.
Anytime.
But we have a good time. And all we're trying to do is just to provide a site where you have some high quality reflection about the social misery, both here and around the world, and the various forms of resistance and critique to that social misery. But we also spend a lot of time with the musicians, from Bootsy Collins to Lecrae to Rhapsody and so forth. So that for us, the arts in all of its forms ought to be integral to any serious talk about resistance and critique when it comes to the social misery that we're trying to attend to, be it police murder, economic exploitation of workplace, patriarchal violence, the devaluing of precious trans or gays or lesbians, or whatever form that suffering and social misery takes. And we're having a good time. We got Brother Jeremy, Sister Allie, and the others working with us. And we learn a lot from you all. I tell you that. It's been 1 year now, right? 1 year?
1 year in August it'll be, yeah.
Yes, indeed. Well, you make such a good combination, and Trisha and I make a wonderful combination.
Yeah, I love your vibe. I love it. It's like, it's intellectual, but very accessible. It's not formal or stuffy. It's like very joyful, even though you're talking about very serious things. And I love, it's very funny too. You guys have a very funny, yeah.
You're very kind. I appreciate that.
No, it's great. Yeah.
I appreciate that. No, indeed.
For humor, it's kind of it's a strange time, right? I mean, there isn't a whole lot of that in media these days, and especially in political media. What do you think that's all about? Because that is something that's been very notable with you always. You've always had a great sense of humor, but I don't see it so much
we've actually
in others.
We plan to reach out to Brother David Chappelle. He's one of the great artistic geniuses when it comes to comedy. But this is recent 846. He even held off on the jokes. He held back from the humor. But I think that humor is always a fundamental part of whatever the human situation is. I mean, I think that, we had our Jewish brothers and sisters in the most indescribably evil situation in the Holocaust, and they had jokes in concentration camps, which meant that they didn't allow the Nazis to suffocate their humanity, even though they were trying to do that. And jokes, humor, grin, touch, sound, noise, music, all of these are the most primal forms human beings have of objectifying their grief and not allowing their grief to completely suffocate what it is to be human for them. And therefore, I hope that the comics take off. Richard Pryor, in the 1960s, that genius, he has some funny things to say right in the midst of catastrophe.
Yeah, and it's such a truth-telling tool also.
Absolutely.
And it reaches people, I think, in a way that in these dark times, I mean, it is a way to cut through stuff, because people just don't want to hear something that's it's not that using the comedy to talk about serious things, it doesn't make light of it, but it just kind of makes it's in a different form, so people are more willing to hear it. They're more open to hearing it. They kind of seek it out more. But you're also it is resistance, maybe.
That's hopefully, so true. And I think too, we Americans, we are such a profoundly anti-intellectual culture. So that if you try out the isms, you're only going to speak to a small slice. If you try out just the arguments, you're going to speak to a small slice. But if you can connect the insight, wisdom, and analysis in a humorous discourse, there's a way in which it gets beneath. And so there's something positive about it. The negative thing about it is the anti-intellectual impulse becomes such a dumbing down that people don't want to think critically, even in the form of the music, the humor, all the other forms of weaponry that are available to human beings that don't ascend to an abstract level of discourse, you see. And so we have to really understand the specificity of U.S. culture. You see, America is a business culture. It's a market culture, and it's hungry for titillation and stimulation. But if you can tuck into that stimulation and titillation some real caring and nurturing, that's what our great artists have been able to do. We talk about Pryor, but we could talk about, look at Sondheim is an intellectual, but he couches it in a form that touches all of us. That's part of his genius. Louis Armstrong did the same thing. I mean, our artists do the same thing. So we have to, Prince and I used to talk about this all the time, because Prince would just read all the time. You know, we celebrating his birthday.
Yeah.
One of my favorites, yeah.
Yeah, and I miss him. I used to travel all around the country and the world with him, to Montreux and other places. We had long, long dialogues at Paisley Park. And he'd walk around with his books, his Jehovah's Witness, reading John Henry Clark, reading, is it true that the Hebrew scripture got African people in it in relation to my faith? Da, 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 da. We'd have a good time. But he knew that his vocation was one of a geniality, which is the real root of genius, which is the largeness of heart, mind, and soul that then pours out into others and touches others. That's part of the genius of American culture, really, even given all the limitations and all of the parochialism that goes along with the culture. And we got something to celebrate in terms of being able to trot out those kind of figures. But, you know, we're not going to produce no Tolstoys or Flauberts or Beethoven's. That's not the USA. Oh, not at all.
You reminded me when you said the Holocaust, humor in the Holocaust. It reminded me of, and I'm, as a secular lefty Jew myself, I identify with that tradition. Larry David, some of my favorite episodes of Curb Your Enthusiasm are Holocaust related, and it's just, yeah, they're very controversial, but they're funny, and they're a coping mechanism too.
Absolutely. No, indeed. I tell you, you know, we need a long series of deep reflections on the depths and richness of the secular Jewish culture that came from the old world into Brooklyn and the Bronx and other places that held on to the Hesed, the unbelievable attempt to engage in the Tikkun Olam, mending and changing of the world, motivated by compassion for the least of these, orphans and widows and fatherless and motherless, but was profoundly secular. So it tied to a high culture. You see, it was always Dostoevsky and Tolstoy sitting in the background of secular Jewish culture. You see, right. Shostakovich and others, but very street too. You see that in the Saul Bellow novels of Herzog. You see that in Audrey Mark. That is very centered on ideas, but it's tied to the street. It's tied to the temple and the unbelievable intensity of street life. And you get this wonderful hybrid. Highbrow culture, street culture coming out of the ghetto, Montreal, Chicago, New York. We can go to Malin, we can go to Malamud, we can go to Philip Roth coming out of Newark, New Jersey, not the ghetto, no, but middle class Newark, New Jersey. You say, dang, this is interesting. You see, we got black ghettos too. Y'all got Jewish ghettos too. We got to tie to high culture too, but we also rooted to the street too. And you can begin to see some of the elective affinities and commonalities, but very, very different, you know, historical backdrops, because you got 2,000 years with people tied to the text. You're on a high level of literacy, tremendous investment in interpretation and textual commentary, because it defines the very identity. Your very identity as a people is rooted in textual commentary. See, that's not true for black folk. Most of us couldn't even learn how to read till the 1860s. So it's a very different trajectory, but very deep, similar affinities in terms of the connections of being improvisational, high by low brow, a tremendous intellectual curiosity. I'm sorry to go on and on.
No, yeah, it's great. We talked about this with Nina Turner too, the black Jewish connection, yeah.
Oh yeah, no, that's rich. That's rich. That's rich. No, indeed.
The last time I saw you in person was a year and a half ago in Burlington, when just before Bernie was going to launch his presidential campaign, and it seems like it was a million years ago, but it really wasn't.
Was that the one in like November, December, or something like that?
Yeah.
That's the Sanders Institute.
Sanders Institute. Yes.
Jane, I remember that.
Yeah.
And there was so much. I remember there was so much enthusiasm and a sense of this time around. All the forces are lining up. This has a really good shot, and you were there and you spoke very pointedly and very heartfelt in a very heartfelt way about the Sanders campaign and about Bernie. Well, it wasn't a campaign yet, but so much has happened in the interim. He was on the cusp, really, it looked like, for a moment there, of winning, and it all fell apart. I was wondering what your analysis is of what happened, and if you wanted to get into that at all.
Well, that was a fascinating moment for me there in Burlington, because I hadn't seen Brother Bernie in a while. Mm-hmm. And he and I had this, disagreement about my going for Sister Jill Stein and he going for Sister Hillary Clinton. And I had connected, of course, with Brother Nick, who was talking about a movement for a third party. We were there at the founding conference in Washington, D.C. And Brother Bernie and I always have this kind of tacit agreement, because we really are brothers, so our politics don't define fully our relationship. He'll always be my brother even when he's wrong or when he's right. I'll be his brother even when he thinks I'm wrong or when I'm right. But I hadn't seen him in a while. So you remember even in my talk when I told him, I said, even though we disagree, because I was not going to run around the country and talk about how wonderful Hillary was, even given the fact that, certain swing states, I can understand people voting for her. Just like right now with Biden, I think we got to vote in swing states for Biden to get the neo-fascists out of there. But at the same time, you don't run around and tell everybody how great Biden is when we know just how tied he is to deep structures of domination and policies that promote social misery. So that so at that moment, it was a rich one for me, because it was a coming together. And when we hugged each other, we hadn't seen each other for so long.
I remember that.
Even given the disagreements, you see. So when he decided to run again, he gave me a call. I said, yeah, green light ahead. I got the same views and things. And I tried to put some pressure on him in terms of the Middle East and Israeli occupation, and saying more about Yemen, which he did with Roe, and similarly so with Kashmir and Tibet. Any occupied people, we got to be able to hit it head on. And he's always been open to that. Always been open to that. But I knew I was going to go with him, because when it comes to the decrepit state of the U.S. electoral political system, that he was the best and remains the best. But given his competition, it doesn't take a whole lot to be better than most U.S. politicians. Right. I just keep reminding him of that. You know what I mean?
This bar isn't that high.
Right.
That's right. This is not Wednesday night at the Apollo. You got to bring your A game or you going under. No. This is Monday morning, so that you win the Monday morning prize at the Apollo. It's like, okay, you doing all right. You doing all right. And that's the way it is in U.S. politics. You're not going to have the best folk there. It just is what it is. He fell out laughing. I said, I'm telling you the truth, Brother Bernie. But I was glad you did do it. I must have done 112 events and things with him. And would do it again. Would do it again, very much so. I just think that the neoliberal establishment Democratic Party came together, exemplified a level of unity, and defeated us. They crushed us, just overnight. Obama makes his call. Brother P, Sister Amy, they come together so quick overnight. Pow! Anybody but Bernie. Anybody but Bernie. You say, ooh, boy, this is the last gasp, we hope, of these neoliberal folk coming together like this. And we're going to see, what happens. We're going to see what happens in the election. It's going to be a very, I think it's going to be close.
Do you think they did that? I'm sorry to interrupt. Do you think they did that because they sincerely think that this is a strategy that's going to more likely to win, Or do you think this is ideological, like they saw it as a necessity to prevent the Sanders brand of politics, the one that you promoted so much, from succeeding at any cost?
Oh, okay, yeah. See, I think it was a combination of both.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they falsely believed that Bernie had no chance at all in beating Trump because their worldview is so truncated and their world itself is so limited that they could not see a groundswelling for Bernie vis-a-vis Trump. So that they falsely believed that. But the other side, which I think probably even has more weight and gravity, to tell you the truth, is that they knew that if Bernie got the nomination, their donors, their benefactors, their big money people would turn away, and many of them would go for Trump rather than for Bernie, because he's going at their entrenched interest in a serious manner. I mean, look at Brother Clyburn. You know, the Clyburn gets more money than anybody in Congress from big pharmaceutical companies. Now, if Bernie wins, how is Clyburn going to work that out? Like, he can act as black as he wants to, Monday through the next Monday. But that's not going to be enough, because you got black people like other working poor people who want health care and want it for everybody. So that tension would become so undeniably manifest, that hypocrisy would become so undeniably manifest, that that's true for the neoliberals across the board. So you had both elements, I think. I think it's this false belief that Bernie couldn't win, therefore we had to be practical, and all that talk about electability. And the second one was, the ruling class in the financial sector would undergo such transformation, it would look as if there were no Democratic Party at all without that big money behind it.
Right. I mean, if Bernie had won the nomination, you'd immediately see like all these sinecures would evaporate, all these positions in Washington.
That's right.
All bureaucracies would be transformed immediately. People would be put out of jobs they've had for a long time.
That's right.
How big of a factor do you think that was in all this?
I think in the end that was probably the biggest one. I really do. It was the biggest one, because I mean, what Bernie represented, and sometimes it was not always intentional, because Bernie himself, I think, has an ambivalence about his relation to the neoliberal wing of the ruling class in our society, that in principle, he has a very heartfelt critique, and his movement is over against the democratic neoliberal establishment. At the same time, he's been in Congress for so long that his world has been shaped by having some alliance and coalition with the neoliberal ruling class of the country, that he has a connection, and he does not mind belonging. You know, he's not obsessed with it, but he doesn't mind belonging.
That's something that I heard. I did a couple of stories about the campaign, and I heard a lot of sort of current and former Sanders staffers make that exact point, that Bernie, for all the propaganda about him being this radical who was going to overturn the system, he actually really saw himself as a member of the system and believes in it in a way that's, at the core of his self-image. He sort of deeply believes in the whole system of, how laws get passed in the House, and he's very impressed with that structure. Do you think that they misunderstood, that there was a misunderstanding of how radical Sanders is? And was that a difference that you and he had, by the way?
Well, it was a slight difference, because, I mean, I do believe that you have to be jazz-like and improvisational and always have an inside-outside strategy. Mm-hmm. And I like his inside-outside strategy. A lot of times it should have a little bit more dance in it. And what I mean by dance in it, you got to be able to move quickly. You know what I mean? You can't be flat-footed at all. You can't get caught in one stance too long. You can't be stationary and static for too long. Whereas I think Bernie, given his history, he was just lucky to get included at all as an independent. See, that's why his relation to Biden is something that, many of us, both understand, but would never be part of it. You see, he could run around and talk about how wonderful Biden is. He's a decent man. He embraced me. He and Jane and me and Jane and his wife could go off and socialize and have these wonderful times. I said, hey, I appreciate, sensitivity to people's humanity. I don't want to be reductionist about these relationships. But, Biden is still Biden. And let us be very clear about that in terms of architect of the largest prison system in the history of the modern world, geared at poor people disproportionately chocolate, or a war. There's a war of a crime against humanity. More than 500,000 Iraqis killed, each life precious. He can't say hardly a mumbling word about it and brags about it for so long, up until a few years ago. Those for me, that is the so much of the ugliness and the callousness of the neoliberal project. You see that it just turns its back on these vicious policies and then brings in some black folk and some women and some gays and lesbians and so let's make the class hierarchy much more colorful.
Right.
And we want inclusive and we want diversity and so forth and so on. It's that kind of orientation that Bernie's critical of in principle, even though on the ground he's still very much a part of it. And it's understandable given the fact that he's had to deal with that every day of his life for over 30 years.
It reminds me of I always think of it as they want to replace, the neoliberals want to replace a top 1% that's straight, white, and male with a diverse top 10%, like a rainbow coalition that's slightly more equitable, but still totally about, a power imbalance.
Absolutely. And see, the imperial hierarchy remains the same.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
800 military bases still out there. AFRICOM still operating. You still got the policies in the Middle East and Asia and Latin America being promoted. It's just more colorful now. Oh, we've got some black generals now.
Right.
And they love to wave that flag just like the white ones do. In fact, they might even be better at it. They got a little rhythm and they wave, You say, oh, I see. That's what we're talking about. Y'all miss Martin King's message. You miss Malcolm's message. You miss Edward Said. You miss what Heschel was talking about. All of the great prophetic voices of the past. And none of them are perfect. Don't get me wrong. They all had their challenges too. But at the core of what they were after was not this attempt to downplay the status quo and just fill it up with diversity and inclusion.
Right.
That was something that they were highly suspicious of, and rightly so.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a consistent theme of yours over the years, that you can't argue for racial progress without also arguing, for instance, against Wall Street corruption, right? And that these things have to be tied together, and that you have to be suspicious of when you see the one critique without the other, or without these other issues tied to it.
That's exactly. And even now on the streets, this marvelous flow and wave of brothers and sisters of all colors, disproportionately younger on the streets. They got to make that connection between police murder, Wall Street crimes, drones, imperial crimes, all being part and parcel of a system, and politicians of whatever color, for the most part, beholden to the police power, the Wall Street power, and the Pentagon power. And there has to be ways in which we understand this that also accent the what I call the moral and the spiritual dimension of it. Because you see, part of the problem of the American empire, Melville understood this, F. Scott Fitzgerald understood this, Toni Morrison, Muriel Rukeyser, they all understood this, that, in a market culture, it saps the best of the human spirit in terms of integrity, honesty, decency, and generosity. It becomes one of manipulation. How to get over, what Pat Horowitz in his minor classic of 1967 called making it. Making it. You see, so that here, you got, on the one hand, you got Chomsky saying, I'm trying to keep the faith, and the faith has to do with looking at the world from below, but you trying to make it, Pat Horowitz, and you're sending that message out, not just to your Jewish community, but to America and the world. It's really about just making it. And making it is all about status, power, position, and looking at the world through the lens of the stock market. And so you end up with very different lenses through which you view things. And so the moral and spiritual dimension, it could be secular, it could be Buddhist like bell hooks, it could be Judaic like Michael Lerner, it could be, it could be Hindu like the legacy of Gandhi, even though you want Ambedkar there because the Dalit brothers and sisters were never really part of Gandhi's project. But there's still things that we can learn from Gandhi, even given his refusal to call for the dismantling of caste. But all of these different traditions have a moral and spiritual dimension. And for young people, it's primarily music. You see, music's the last form of transcendence, really, in the market culture of our empire, of the U.S. empire. And so you have to always bring in this role of how do you be a certain kind of person that's fallible, open, humble, but also full of moral tenacity and willing to throw down, willing to live, willing to die. And that's a high level of spiritual development that's hard to achieve in such a decadent market culture of the American empire. It really is.
But isn't that also a way in to reforming the United States? The United States, for all of its flaws, that market culture does allow you to succeed and broadcast the message if you make great music, if you can make great comedy, great art. It'll get out of the way and let you do it if it has a popular appeal. Isn't that kind of a bit of a weakness in the American empire, if there is one?
Well, it is. It's a beautiful, beautiful aspect of the American empire. That's one of the reasons why our culture is hegemonic around the world. Hip hop now and jazz 100 years ago, and rhythm and blues 50 years ago,
movies,
musical theater, and then of course the films and so forth. And even in some ways are the best of our literature. I think Melville will be read much longer than Flaubert will, for example. Mm-hmm. But see, the challenge here is, and this is where we had to get very, very both serious and in some ways sad. See, there's a real chance that the American empire does not have the capacity to be fundamentally transformed. See, so that it will allow for all of the soft power and culture in the world. But when stronger movements on the ground actually begin to bring power and pressure to bear, they shoot us down like dogs.
It's almost like
the way John Wayne was shooting our indigenous brothers and sisters. The repressive apparatus of the United States is so thick that, if Prince decided to join up with Malcolm X's legacy and create a movement with his music, he could start off playing a little Kiss, then move on into I Adore, and then the next day, people were willing to move into D.C. and seize power. Prince is a dead man in America. He's gone. They will kill you in a minute. Now, one can argue everybody does that. Well, yes, but in the United States, there's this illusion that you get all this freedom, the social movements have a right to protest and so forth and so on. But in the States, the history of black folks especially, anytime you raise your white supremacy in a serious way, you're a dead woman or a dead man for the most part. If not, if you're alive, then you get character assassination every day. So that you wonder, Marcuse's one-dimensional society, you wonder whether the American empire even has the capacity to undergo the kind of nonviolent revolution or any other kind of revolution. It would rather go fascist than go serious left-wing progressive. And see, that's something that we leftists have continually had to contend with. You see, because we say to ourselves, well, God, are we really sure that this thing can change, that this place can really undergo a revolution? The Civil War was a revolution, but that's 700,000 people dead. The civil rights was not a revolution. It was significant reform. And for the black middle class and the black bourgeoisie, they were breakdancing. Even given the discrimination, they started breakdancing. For the black poor and the black working class, it got worse because their condition was never the measure of black progress. the measure of black progress was Oprah and them on the top. Oh, they doing wonderful. Oh, you got a black president. You got black professors at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. What more do black people want? Oh my God, you want to just take over everything.
Right. And then the myth of post-racial society, right?
Or then even post-racial, you know. So that, you know, and you're seeing this today, you know, I call it a Wizard of Oz moment. It's like Obama, you know, you got this great authority and then little Toto just pulls that curtain back. See this cat working, very little capacity to deliver, not a whole lot of backbone, tied to Wall Street, tied to the counter-terrorist policies of Brennan, dropping the drones, but he's supposed to be some grand culmination of the black freedom struggle. No, it's the Wizard of Oz. He has no clothes, no spines at all. We see the same thing at the universities, you know, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. We have such a diverse faculty. You just scratch the surface. God, you're still at 3.2%. Doesn't sound like you're on the cutting edge of wrestling with the legacy of white supremacy in terms of the presence of black folk at Harvard. Yes, but we got Skip Gates, we got West, we got so forth. Yes, let's just scratch the surface, What else is beneath? Hardly at all. Hardly at all. Well, we got black deans. Yes, you do. It's a beautiful thing. What is percentage of your faculty?
Mm-hmm.
You see. What's the presence of the classes in your curriculum? How many students even take the courses in your curriculum? So that, I don't want to deny the progress, but as Malcolm used to say, you don't stab folk 9 inches, pull it out 6 inches and celebrate your progress. No, even when you pull the knife out, you don't celebrate because the wound is so deep and the blood is still flowing, you see. And so we say to ourselves, well, what do? Back to the blues, back to the musician. Blow your horn, sing your song, write your book, engage in your work and your calling, be part of a collective and social movement, and be ready to die and pass it on to the younger generation. That's the best we can do.
You just mentioned something I wanted to ask about. You talked about is the American empire capable of being transformed? Is there a possibility for a nonviolent ethos or revolution to succeed? Now there's some controversy about that now within the protest community, and I know you've talked in the past about making sure that we follow the highest spiritual standards of Martin Luther King and Fannie Lou Hamer, but what's your feeling about that? Because it does feel like there's been a little bit of a sea change within the quote unquote left or liberalism about the efficacy of violent or nonviolent protest.
I mean, one is that I don't think we should ever be dogmatic about any of these things. See, I'm not like Martin Luther King Jr. I'm not an absolute pacifist. Mm-hmm. I would have fought against the Nazis. Even in the Jim Crow army, I would have fought against a thug named Hitler. I would have fought against the apartheid regime, the spirit of the nation. You see, I would have joined the army. You see, I believe in just war.
Franco in Spain.
Very, very specific circumstances under which you have to engage in violence, usually tied to both self-defense or tied to an evil regime that is so overwhelmingly objectionable that the only option that one can pursue would be a violent one, you see. So in that sense, if there were a chance to engage in fundamental transformation and it looked as if violence was the only means and it looked as if the result would not be more terror and more violence and more hatred, I'd be very much a part of that, you see. But you have to have such a mature level of organization. You have to have such a mature level of leaders with vision. And, you can have thugs on the left just like you can have thugs in the center and thugs on the right in terms of their spirits. See, there's a lot of people that have the same leftist analysis that I have, but I don't want to spend too much time with them because they're not soulful enough for me. They ain't got enough love for me, you know what I mean? I said, oh, no. So that, I'm in the streets with them because they've got a strong analysis and so forth, but you need to have more than that. But I'm not an absolute pacifist the way Brother Martin was. I've had long discussions with Brother Desmond Tutu on this. When I was in South Africa, we almost got killed together at Deduza, the great moment of Deduza when the black folk turned on each other. And I happened to be there with Tutu. And Tutu, you know, he's nonviolent all the way. Not me. I start swinging, goddamn. Shit. No, I got a lot of street in me. A whole lot of street in me. Absolutely.
It seems like there's like a conflation, though, also of vandalism and violence. I mean, a lot of what we've seen has been vandalism, a lot of what's called violent. And I do think that there's a shift. A lot of people who in the past would condemn this have said that a lot of the change would not have happened without the vandalism, without the burning the police station, without the burning down the Wendy's. Even people who I think before this happened would have condemned that. I think there's a realization, and Matt, you and I may have a disagreement on this, but I think among some people, there's a realization that this does have some efficacy.
No, I think you're right. I think that's a very important distinction, though, my dear sister, in terms of vandalism versus violence. I think it was true in the 60s, you know, Detroit and Newark in 67 and Watts in 65. That you see, again, in a market culture, property has a sanctity. The sanctity of private property, the sanctity of corporate profits as the precondition of your democracy. That's part of the American covenant, you see. And so when they see the property burning, they think of their own property, they think of businesses that they're connected to. And for them, the self and property go hand in hand. So it's almost an attack on persons when you attack the properties. And it's amazing, really, that thank God, you know, there's been so few people, or whoever they are, who die, you know, in 67. And you got Newark and Detroit already, that's almost 75, 80 people who died, both civilians and police. You see, that's a different level of violence. You think you got 2,000 cities and hardly anybody dies. So that's highly extraordinary when you think about it in America, given the centrality of violence in America, you see. So that but a lot of people assimilate the vandalism with the violence. And but I mean, what that does is it allows the right wing, the neo-fascists, to justify to themselves an intense contempt and hatred to be expressed. And so you have the backlash, you have the neo-fascist clampdown. I still think it's coming. It's probably in the process right now, but I do think it's coming. It almost spilled over with the military turning on us, on citizens there in Washington, D.C. Almost reached that point. Trump was ready to do it, then they began to pull back. But I think it's still coming. I think that the neo-fascists, you know, they when you look in their eyes in Charlottesville a couple of years ago, well, these cats, they serious. There's a level of willingness to die that I wish we had more of on the left. You see, they came with their guns loaded, with their masks. They standing right next to us within almost 12 things, spitting and cussing and carrying out and listening to black music. That's an interesting thing. You go to the park, these thugs were listening to Motown. You see, so you can see how they've been shaped by American culture. They couldn't get away from it, but they can't stand black people. They can't stand Jewish people. And of course, the Klan used to hate Catholics.
Right.
David Duke, the Catholic, head of one branch of the Klan. That's U.S. upward mobility. That's what upward mobility American style is among the right wing. You can now have a Catholic head of the Klan. Right. And I did see a black man walking with him too. People don't like to talk about that Negro. He's walking with him too. He had the U.S. flag and the cat right next to him had the Nazi flag. So, you know, so I mean, next thing they're going to have Jewish brothers and sisters join. You said, hey, yes, human beings are human beings. They choose to be gangsters. Anybody can choose to be a gangster, no matter who they are. You see. But usually that kind of hatred of blacks and Jews, Catholics less so now, still makes it difficult for blacks and Jews to become a part of that kind of extreme movement, even though we got a whole lot of black and Jewish folk that's part of the conservative establishment, the neoliberal establishment, and we have to be honest and candid about that.
But even Netanyahu, you know, likes to cozy up with Orban's fascist anti-Semites in like Poland and Hungary. I mean, that's like, they use the Holocaust to justify all the abuse of Palestinians, and then they wind up like aligning with people who actually did, like in Poland, they actually passed a law saying you couldn't blame the Holocaust on Poland. And it was a very awkward moment for Netanyahu.
That's very, very true. I mean, that's why we've got to be morally consistent no matter what. I mean, at that point, it's never just a matter of what is strategic and tactical, but it's that, no, we're staying in contact with the humanity of those Jewish folk in France who are getting trashed. We're staying in contact with the humanity, these Palestinian brothers and sisters under this vicious Israeli occupation. We stand in contact with humanity, the peasants in Brazil. We stand in contact with humanity, with our poor white brothers and sisters in Appalachia. We stand in contact with humanity of Brother Floyd and the black folk who get shot down. There has to be that kind of moral consistency across the board that's not in any way driven by any kind of narrow tactical and strategic thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I'll up on that if I could, because I thought that was an important point that Dr. King often wrote about and spoke about, was that it's not merely a tactical question, or at least it wasn't for him, that there was also this profound moral dimension to hit, at least as he understood it, the principles of nonviolence, that in your action, you want to avoid radiating more bitterness through the universe, that this is something that is important for not only for the movement, but for your own self. But this feels, again, controversial now in a way that it hasn't been in a while. That moral question that he grappled with quite a lot in public, I don't hear it spoken about as much right now. What's your feeling about that?
No, I think you're right about that. But I think we have to keep in mind, my dear brother, that in the 1960s, I can remember having debates with my dear brother Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. I used to bring him to Princeton all the time. And it was intense because they'd have all these different marches against him on all kinds of different issues, Zionist, racist, and so forth. I say, no, we're gonna have a dialogue, and we would go at each other. And he represented a very, very crucial perspective, because I had a lot of agreement with him in terms of his critiques of the empire and capitalism and what have you. But he kept saying that the issue of morality had to be subordinate. And I was arguing, no, it's got to be superordinate. And that after King's death, King's position was more and more minority. It was more and more minority. It really was. And so up until 68, with King's presence, it was strong. But remember now, even with King, when he was shot, 55% of black folk disagreed with him and 72% of Americans did. So he was never a popular figure, never. But it became much more a moment of the great inimitable Malcolm X. I mean, Malcolm's moment was after his death, as you know, after he died in February 65. And when he talked about by any means necessary, that was this sense of, look, whatever we do is in some ways justifiable if it somehow furthers the Black freedom movement. And some of us were saying, God, we understand that sentiment, but you could slide down a slippery slope. So you're going to end up with some black gangsters running things in the name of the liberation movement. Or you could end up with black gangsters posing as freedom fighters, but acting as neoliberals in the system. See, because the gangsters come in a lot of different forms. And some of the biggest gangsters, Wall Street, Pentagon, Congress, higher echelons of the professions. Very, very sharp and well-mannered. But as Melville said, oh my God, look, just scratch. You see an Indian hater and a slave holder and a man of property who's subordinating these workers and manipulating these women, but walking around so calm and serene. That's in Pierre. You see, that's Melville's prophecy. You see, he's absolutely right. Just takes different circumstances these days. And so that battle in the 60s, after 68, though, is one that in some ways we're recycling. And it has to be worked out and fought out over and over again. I mean, some of my closest partners, people like Glenn Ford, the Black Gender Report. I love that brother. Margaret Kimberly. Or, of course, Carl Dix, Revolutionary Communist Party, with Bob Ovechkin. You know, we've been to jail many times. And we argue all the time. They still got their own kind of analysis of Mao and so forth and so on. You know, they go, oh, Brother West, you got that old king morality, spirituality, talk about music all the time. It's nice, but when it gets down to it, really, this morality may not play the same kind of role that you want it to play. And I said, well, you know, I'm not sure. Jumi Baraka, who I have great respect for, Black Alliance for Peace, their critique of empire is just indispensable. But you always push in terms of this role of morality and spirituality. I think tied to music. I think music itself is sedimented with a spirituality and a morality that connects us, human to human, creature to creature, person to person, you see.
Didn't Bayard Rustin, I remember reading or hearing that Bayard Rustin convinced Martin Luther King not to keep a gun in the house. But someone just told me recently that Martin Luther King, it was Malaika Jabali, I believe, who's an excellent journalist, that Martin Luther King would stay with people who had guns often.
Absolutely, that's true.
So
that's true.
Even those questions of principles and absolutes, I guess what I've long thought that like nonviolent direct action was just the most, not even on a moral level, but just on a tactical, strategic level, the way to go, because clearly we're, like the left or people will never outarm the right or the state.
That's true.
But it does seem like you can offer, you can make a moral argument for, certainly for vandalism, if vandalism is moving the conversation in a way that will either reform or defund or whatever the outcome is. But if this is going to be some kind of turning point, you could easily argue that it's the moral thing to do, especially when it's vandalism and not harming human beings.
Even when you talk about vandalism, I'm just against looting, even though I began with the kind of legalized looting of Wall Street and the vicious kind of violent-driven looting of the Pentagon. But I think looting itself is wrong, and we have to say that across the board. But when you look at which businesses actually are looted in most of these rebellions and uprisings, it's not on the vanilla side of town. Most of it's on the chocolate side of town. You see, so you get this weak, lumping black bourgeoisie, weak entrepreneurial class that gets attacked, or some of our Korean brothers and sisters whose businesses are in the hood. Now more and more Arab businesses that were in the hood, 80 years ago, it was often Jewish small businesses, men and women who were in the hood. They were the only ones who were willing to actually be in the area that was viewed as undesirable from the vantage point of most business people. They're the ones who bear the brunt. So even when we look at vandalism, if we looked at it just tactically and strategically, you would say, good God, yeah, I think it's wrong to vandalize any business. But if you're going to go that route, why are you attacking Jamal and Letitia's business and leaving Mr. McGillicuddy's business intact? What's going on? Brother West, are you saying we need to go across town and attack? No, I'm not saying that. I'm just raising the issue.
If you're going to do
why it is that this is the particular form of vandalism. You see what I mean? And so, and when you look at it from the vantage point of the small black Korean Arab business group in the black community, they've been there with the folk all the time. This is not Walmart we're talking about at all. This is not, who is it, J.P. Morgan and all these other folk now. Because see, what is happening now, of course, is that the black bourgeoisie is in for a big bonanza. Because these corporate folk are running scared. They throwing money like, I don't know what. Take this, take these millions, take these millions. They even got the fashion world giving up all these millions and millions of dollars. Who's gonna get that money? You think folk on the ground gonna get it? No. Working class gonna get it? No. It's gonna be black middle class folk. I'll take it. I'll take it. I'm working on a program that I got a program. Oh, really? All right. And I'm not against that. I'm just saying that kind of philanthropy just reproduces a hierarchy all over again. This is not just a movement for philanthropic concessions. We're looking for fundamental transformation of institutions and structures. And as long as those institutions and structures refuse to undergo serious change, their basic response by instinct is going to be philanthropic. Take the money. Take the money. You can't even open the New York Times now without seeing 2/3 of the face is black. I'm almost tired of seeing so many Negroes in the New York Times. Hey, why you gonna put them all up in the front now because you're in trouble? Everywhere you go, just put black folk in there. Put black folk. The museums, you got all of a sudden now all the black artists, their work is just thrown out in the front. Hey, save space for Picasso. You know, good God Almighty, what is it? Just a matter of that crude response to power? That's the questions I think that have to be raised, you see. And it has to be raised, you know, in such a way that it's not, people don't misunderstand it. Because I'm not against the black bourgeoisie. I'm against the greed. I'm against the parochialism. I'm against the narrowness of any bourgeoisie. I don't care who it is. But it could be black, Catholic, Jewish, Italian, Polish, whatever. And that's the kind of moral consistency, again, that's very important. But, you know, these days, I'm telling you, it's going to be true for the next 6 to 9 months. For 6 to 9 months, it's going to be black folk everywhere. Everywhere you look. And then you look about another year and a half. If we haven't fundamentally transformed the system, they're going to try to co-opt, they're going to try to buy folk off, or they try to kill off the serious ones, and they think they can go back to business as usual. But I think there's a chance that they won't be able to go back to business as usual. I think we can make a real advance. I really do. I think we can make a real advance because this was unprecedented. Very much.
And just the last question for me is, how does that advance take place, and what's the structure under which it takes place? Because I for me personally, I have difficulty seeing that as Biden gets elected and somehow magically change happens. I don't particularly see it as something that is going to be implemented by a series of corporations that are going to say they've instituted new policies. That sounds suspicious to me as well. So how do you get to, well, we're going to address drone warfare, we're going to address greed on Wall Street, all these things that are fundamental that they're going to fight to prevent? Very, very much so. Like that's what I have difficulty seeing how that happens.
I agree. I think that what Brother Barber's trying to do and what Sister Thea Harris is trying to do in raising the issue of poverty, because there you have multiracial, multigender, multireligious solidarity. And you have to talk a language of abolition. So we don't want no left-wing version of slavery where you treat the slaves nice every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday and still have slaveholders. We don't want a left-wing version of Jim Crow where you only lynch the Negroes every 3 weeks as opposed to every week. Well, we don't want no liberal, neoliberal version of predatory capitalism these days. You see, we got to abolish poverty. We have to abolish decrepit schools. We have to abolish the kinds of mass incarceration regime. Well, how do you do that? Well, when you bring a whole host of people together with the same intensity that you're bringing people together around Brother Floyd, around those issues, you're going to get some concessions and not just philanthropic. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, you ain't going to get revolution. Not at all. But what M. Goldman used to say, she said, if just voting could lead to a revolution, the ruling class would make voting illegal. Emma understood. Right. Because she'd been to jail many times. She knew what that nation state could do to people, you see. She was one of the great ones. But I do think when you start getting powerful concessions from the nation state and from the corporate elites and the military elites. You're not going to be able to drop these drones, or we're going to have such massive pressure. It's going to so thoroughly unstable your society. You're going to have to rethink it. Again, not revolution, but that kind of pressure could be a real possibility as the escalating political consciousness of those in the street takes place. And that's what many of us are after, you see. Because I think you're right. You know, we don't have, that's why Medicare for All was so fundamental, and why Brother Bernie was so fundamental. Because once you start talking about Medicare for All, it is an indictment of big pharmaceutical companies, an indictment of private insurance companies, and that is a transformation of a whole sector of our economy. And it's not socialism, it's not communism, it's something decent, but it certainly is something that requires, you know, deep change, very much so. And they're trying to push that back, and they're trying to make sure we don't make the connections. That's why our dialogue is so very important, you see. They don't want us to make the connections to come together, you see.
Right.
Not at all, not at all.
No, they want niche market.
Ooh,
Niche market
that's it.
change, yeah.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. Niche market change. Ooh, 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 ooh.
I like
we gotta
it.
make a song out of that.
Yeah.
You got to trademark that.
Yeah.
That's all right. That's all right.
Excellent.
God, Mike, I got to talk to Bootsy about that.
Yeah. So in terms of what the concessions would look like around the police, what do you think we should be fighting for? What should people be demanding? That's one question. And then I have a question. I don't know if you want to talk about this, but I saw that I'll call it a wretched display of shouting, not from you, but from others on a certain show on Fox News. And where you were not really allowed to speak because that Leo guy has a very annoying voice. That's neither here nor there. But I wanted to know if you wanted to say anything that you were trying to say that wasn't as audible because they were speaking over you so much. If you wanted, just to give you a chance to, if you wanted to say that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and as you know, that was such a heavy day with Brother Floyd's family and him being put in the ground. And then my dear brother Anderson Cooper had allowed me to go on the show right before. So when I shifted from Brother Anderson to Brother Sean, you know, it was like a shift from, good God, like Aretha singing on the one hand, and somebody isolated way off in a corner singing in a shower. So it was a major drop.
Right.
And my spirit was so raw. And I never heard of the brother before. I never even saw what he looked like. And I thought it was just going to be Sean and I having a dialogue. So all of a sudden, this guy just comes out of the thing, and the level of disrespect. See, three things I can't stand. I can't stand disrespect. I can't stand lack of gratitude. And I can't stand arrogance. Those three things set me off. That's just who I am, you see. And he had all three of them. And I said, whew, I went off. And I'm glad I did, because I was just being honest. You know, I had to be myself and so forth. But it was sad that we couldn't have a discussion about the police. Because what I was trying to say was that the notion of defunding the police for me fundamentally means a reshift in resources so that you zero in on precisely those kind of things like housing and education, jobs with a living wage. You still have a public safety system, but you don't have a punitive orientation. And that requires then very much like massive cuts in the budget for military on a national level. It requires cuts in policing, and it's tied much more to the serving and the protecting. It's not eliminating protection, but it's understanding protection under the rubric of public safety. And public safety as a guardian is a very different orientation than this policing as some kind of a foreign occupied army in a black or brown or indigenous people's neighborhood, you see. And I think that all of these discussions are very, very good ones. They're very, very important. In Newark, where we talked about civilian oversight, of course, they're taking that to court now, the police union taking that to court. You have to have some community control over these. And you need to have police who come from your community. You can't have folks just coming in from vanilla suburb whose stereotype of black people is some kind of figure they see on cops to show that they just cancel. Coming in every day in a community that you have no connection with. They don't see you as shopping. They don't see you walking around. They don't see your kids playing in the same little league or singing in the same choirs or playing in the same bands and so forth. So all of that is important, but I don't think any of the talk now coming out of the neoliberals, be it Biden or Obama or Pelosi or the neo-fascists of Trump and company, all their talk about police reform, I think, is pretty empty.
Yeah.
It's still very, very empty for the most part. You got one more, my brother?
Yeah, just really quickly, what about statistics-based policing? Sort of broken windows theory policing, this strategy that relies on very high numbers of engagements over very minor offenses, quality of life arrest, that kind of thing, which has had bipartisan support for decades. I mean, I remember I've talked to a lot of cops for doing stories over the years who hate that strategy and feel like that's a big part of the problem. Is that something that would be a good fix, or would be part of the solution anyway?
You mean to eliminate that kind of?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I used to sit in on the lectures of James Q. Wilson at Harvard, who's very much responsible.
Co-author. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Oh, he's very much responsible for that.
Mm-hmm.
And he's responsible for a whole host of other things that have been quite ugly in terms of our society at large. And I've been blessed to teach in prison. I just gave a commencement address just 3 days ago. I've taught in prison for 37 years. And I've seen the swell of the folk as a result of these punitive policies resulting from this broken glass theory in which you actually hunt people down very early, try to somehow zero in on the predators, the language of Joseph Biden on the floor of the Senate, or super predators, the language of Hillary Clinton right before the committee there in Congress. And they had the consensus of right wing of the ruling class and the liberal wing of the ruling class. Democratic establishment, liberal, Republican Party, right wing, and now neo-fascist. And many of us were raising voices then. Of course, we were just voices in the wilderness at that point. Mm. We thought that we had just lost our minds, didn't realize you had to be tough on crime to win any election. You had to be tough on crime. Look at the capitulation of the Black Congressional Caucus in this regard. Look at the capitulation of the NAACP, National Urban League. So many of them didn't want to raise their voices. And we won't even get into the Obama years, where we saw the worst of the black bourgeoisie. Nobody could raise a critical word on the black face of the empire, as brilliant and poised and beautiful as his family is. And he does have a very beautiful family. That's a beautiful thing. And they're wonderful parents, but still head of the empire and still militarizing the police, still tied to Wall Street and drones and so on. So that this disposition toward criminal thinking and and outright criminalizing of poor people and black people, thank God, has been radically called into question. And that's partly been an intellectual and ideological issue having to do with Michelle Alexander, Angela Davis, Glenn Lowry, Bruce Weston. There's a whole Waquant from Chicago. All of those folk played a very important role in shifting the climate of opinion. There's no doubt about that.
Alex,
but where it heads and where it ends up is an open question. But in the meantime, I want to end on this note because, when you live in the kind of times that we do that are catastrophic, where the planet itself just might not be around that long, or nuclear catastrophe is still a real possibility, that you have to fortify your soul in such a way that nobody ever is able to steal your joy, your precious memories, your style, and your smile. That's what it is to be a blues man, blues woman. Y'all know about the blues man and blues woman. They go through hell and high water and still got a light inside that shines in such a way, like Bootsy said, Stars ain't got no name, they shine. Sly Stone say everybody is a star, not just those on the stage, not just celebrities. Everybody got the light that can shine if you have enough courage to have a sense of history, to connect with the past. So you something that people gave you, the love your parents gave you, the love your partners gave you, the music that's inside of you. Can't nobody take that away, ever. And that allows you to keep your style intact even though you're growing, and to keep that smile on your face even though you're crying on the inside. See, that's something that we need to say over and over and over again in grim days. And keep in mind, for Black people for 400 years in this hemisphere, it's been grim every day. It's been grim every day.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you so much for coming, and that was a great talk. It was really,
really, I love
really
y'all.
interesting.
Love y'all. Respect you all. I'm telling you, you're doing a wonderful work.
Thank you. Yeah, this is so great.
Come back anytime.
Yeah.
Stay strong. Stay strong.
All right. Take care now.
Right on.